Chapter 7. Service in North Wales 1942 to 1944. It was a mixed group of Commonwealth aircrew that journeyed by train on the 30th of May, 1942, from South Cerney in Gloucestershire to R.A.F Penrhos near Pwllheli in Carnarvonshire in North Wales. First of all, we had difficulty pronouncing the names correctly, especially Pwllheli, until we learned enough of the Welsh pronunciation to get somewhere close. Phonetically, Pwllheli had to do. The group I was with comprised 3 Canadians, 1 Australian, 1 New Zealander and 2 of us British. As we steamed on through the English countryside and the magnificent North Wales scenery, we realized we were going a very long way off the main tracks. The last train ride was from Bangor on the main London to Holyhead line, to Pwllheli 3 miles from R.A.F Penrhos. We passed the mix of mountains and coast through the Snowdonia mountain range and Lane Peninsula. All of the overseas boys had different names to describe the remote area we were going to be stationed. To the Aussies, it was way out in the bush. To the Kiwi, way out in the wop-wops, and to the Canadians it was way past the end of nowhere. Fortunately, the weather was beautiful along with the scenery, and the late May sunshine showed us all its best. Penrhos was a small airfield with just a grass surface and low hills surrounding on 3 sides, with the 4th side facing the sea on the edge of the coastline. Number 9 Air Observer School, as it was then called, trained aircrew in navigation, bombing and gunnery, and had a range of aircraft, including Ansons, Whitleys, Army Bolton and Paul Defiance, and ex-Army Cooperation Lysanders. All the aircraft have been handed down from operational squadrons as they became a bit old, or the squadrons re-equipped with more modern aircraft. Our group, we were told, we were to fly the Ansons. After the first night, 1 more Canadian, 1 more Australian and 1 more Brit had joined us. The group captain, in his capacity as station commander, interviewed us and made comments that were very pointed indeed. He was not interested in our gripe that we had wanted to go to operational training, and told us we were there to do a job and that was that. He then gave us a very strong warning against low flying without authority and stated that we would be severely dealt with if caught. With this rather unpleasant interview behind us, we set about making the best of a bad job. At least we were to begin flying over beautiful scenery and the weather was good. Accommodation was in short supply on camp and we were billeted outside in private houses. I was accommodated in a large house with a fine lady named Mrs. Roberts who lived there with her daughter. Accompanying me was one of the Aussies, Laurie Howard from Perth in Western Australia. Laurie was the son of a widowed mother from a farming family. It was also a lay preacher. He was a great chap and we got on very well together, both enjoying a keen sense of humor and love of sport and the outdoors. Being issued with bicycles to travel to and from our billet to the camp also afforded us a means of getting around the lovely North Wales countryside on our days off. We commenced flying by being converted to the Anson aircraft, which was similar to the Oxford but with less vices. The models we flew were the Mark X, powered by Cheetah 9 engines. The Anson had a lower angle of incidence and thereby a lower center of gravity, and because of this, plus a wider undercarriage, it was less prone to swing on takeoff and landing. Although slow, they were a nice aircraft to fly and pretty safe. We carried up to 6 aircrew on training, with a mixture of students and staff instructors who taught the training navigators in navigation and bombing. Their gunnery training was done on the Whitleys, Defiance and Blenheims. The Lysanders towed drogue targets to be used in gunnery practice. The Anson had a manually retracted undercarriage requiring 140 turns on a handle in the cockpit to rise or lower the wheels. It was a poor trainee navigator's job to do the chore. By the time they had done this after takeoff, they were usually almost worn out before they got down to training. Penrhos, with its limited takeoff and landing runs, was not the easiest place to fly out of. The hilly surrounds didn't help either, and whenever possible one took off on a seaward run and landed from the seaward approach. After conversion to the aircraft and a couple of navigation flights with a staff pilot to familiarize in the duties required, we got cracking on the job. They really got us into it in no mean fashion, for we did at least 5 to 6 hours flying every day, either several bombing sorties over the bombing range at a place called Hell's Mouth, or 2, 3-hour navigation cross countries. At this rate we soon got used to the aircraft, the training tasks, and the area to be operated. Mainly we flew over the Irish Sea to the Isle of Man, Western Scotland, Northern Ireland or into West England and other parts of Wales. Being summer, in those first few weeks I did almost 100 hours flying. Whilst I was at Penrose we learned that the first WAFs were to come to the camp. The first one to arrive was a sergeant, and there was an amazing incident at lunch in the mess one day. One of our number was a very highbrow chap called Rumbold, from a family who had a large company manufacturing aircraft accessories. He asked the WAF sergeant, quite seriously, if the WAFs coming to the camp would have intercourse with the men. The poor girl blushed with embarrassment, and seeing her reactions, Rumbold said, "Good God woman, not sexual intercourse, but social intercourse." The funny part was that he meant the latter. Rumbold also figured in another incident when he crashed a Defiant aircraft. The group captain told him he had cost the country £10,000, so Rumbold took out his checkbook and offered to pay for it. This enraged the CO, who threw him out of his office. Surprisingly, at the end of June, I was told that on the 14th of July I was to go to a staff pilot training unit at R.A.A.F. Cark. This was located near Cark in Cartmel in South Lancashire, not far from the Lake District and the North Lancashire seaside resort of Morecambe. Like Penrose, Cark was rather remote, but in a beautiful area. The policy was to send all new staff pilots to Cark, and I went with Sergeant Mac McLean, one of the Canadians who I had met on arrival at Penrose. We left on the 14th of July for the 6-week course. In a way it seemed a strange decision to give us this training when we had already been at the job for 6 weeks and done over 120 flying hours on the Anson. Still, the Air Force policy is policy and you do as you are told. Cark turned out to be something of a sinecure, and we on the course had a great time there. They did not fly us especially hard, and we got plenty of free flights to go into Morecambe and enjoy all its pleasures. Like other places such as Newquay, Bournemouth and Torquay, lots of government officials were evacuated with their lady civil servants. Morecambe boasted a magnificent ballroom called the Winter Gardens, where the top bands played and the dances were great, plenty of willing partners to dance with. We as aircrew were always in demand, and we made the most of the chances available. We would either travel by train or shared a taxi, especially when we missed the last train late at night. One night we made a dash to get on the last train, and as we leapt out of the taxi I rushed onto the platform. With the aid of a lady who held the train door I jumped into the compartment. The only snag was that as we gathered speech she asked me where I was going, and when I said Cark, she said, "Well, this train is going to Kendal, way off the route." The train was, as usual in wartime, blacked out and I could not see her well, but she seemed a nice friendly person. We sat in the carriage and chatted, as one did in the war, commenting on my predicament. I said that I would try the usual stunt and go to the local police station, and be put in a cell for the night. The police were very good when one was stuck like this, and they usually gave you some breakfast as well. After a while she said, "Look, why don't you come home and stay with my mother?" And so off I went, on arrival at Kendal, accompanied by this young lady whose name was Nancy Clough. When we, at last, did get by some light, and I found her to be very attractive, causing me to reflect on my good fortune. Her mother seemed quite happy with the prospect of my staying the night, so I was shown to my room, and after a chat I went to bed. This started a romance which continued all the rest of my time at Cark. I would meet Nancy at the Morecambe dance and then go to Kendal for the night. If I had more time off I would go and stay longer, and we would go around Kendal together. I was very sorry when my time at Cark ended, for it had been a very enjoyable experience both flying wise and socially. We had done a lot of flying over the Scottish Highlands, Northern Ireland and many other lovely spots. The instructors had been very easy to get on with, and usually we all went out together. My stay at Cark remains one of the happiest memories of my early flying days. All good things come to an end, and we were to be brought down to earth with a jolt on return to Penrose, for it was back to work with a vengeance. Firstly, winter was coming, and secondly, we were to move to R.A.F. Llanderog, satellite of Penrose, 30 miles from Pwllheli and just 5 miles outside Carnarvon. It is situated on the western end of the Menai Straits, which separates the Isle of Anglesey and the mainland of North Wales. The third point was that we were to be part of a night flying flight and would be required to do almost exclusively night navigation sorties, still on Anson's. With this posting, it looked as if our chance of going to an operational squadron was further away, and this proved to be correct. We were billeted in a barrack hut, 2 to a room, on a site by the seashore, 2 miles from the sergeant's mess and about a mile from the aircraft and the squadron's facilities. Again, we were all attuned with bikes. I met up again with the other chaps I had been at Pens with, and we formed a real comradeship of young aircrew from such widespread backgrounds and homelands. Being so far from the mess dissuaded us from cycling so far, so for breakfast we worked out a good alternative. Each room was equipped with an iron stove for which we were issued fuel, and with an open top and a cover which could be used to cook on. The overseas boys got very good food parcels sent from home, and this provided a good start. As we were in an area surrounded by farms, us Brits were given the task of scrounging around the local area in search of milk, eggs and butter, plus any tin stuff off ration we could get at shops. By this communal effort we did quite well and made ourselves very cozy. Being on night flying, we were able to sleep in, so breakfast could be prepared and taken at leisure. The routine for the day was to go down to the flight office, find out what duty we were on the night, and carry out short night flying tests on our aircraft. This all happened late morning or early afternoon, and then we were free until reporting for briefing on the night sorties. Llanderog has been correctly described as a dicey little airfield with the close proximity to the Snowdonia mountain range, which runs right along the North Wales mainland. Mount Snowdon, being the second highest in Britain at 3,560 feet, was only about 10 miles or so away. These hazards, coupled with several other factors, resulted in the Snowdon range having more crashes in it than any other similar one in Britain. Notoriously bad weather and, in those days, less reliable aircraft than today, aggravated by limited and rather unreliable radio aids in those aircraft, added to the dangers of flying in the area. In one 6-month period we had over 20 crashes out of Llanderog, and most of them were fatal. Anson's we flew had only HF radio, and these were so antiquated that they gave the wireless operators endless trouble, whilst trying to keep them working to receive and send messages, and to obtain bearings to help fix the aircraft position. The staff wireless operators, most of whom were well up in experience, found the task of getting through difficult enough, and trainees found it even more so. Under these hazardous conditions there was a desire for experienced radio ops and pilots to fly regularly as a pair and build up an efficient partnership. My own wireless op was a Sergeant Ken Coward, and we built up a very confident combination together as time went by, and we got through the many hair-raising stories generated by the aforementioned difficulties. On the 14th of January, 1943, whilst flying a night navigation cross-country to Shrewsbury and back, I probably made one of the momentous decisions of my life. We were flying the leg from Shawbury Airfield near Shrewsbury, when I felt uneasy about the weather. I asked the training navigator if he was sure of his position, and he told me that he was, but I was not convinced and decided to alter course some 60 degrees to starboard on to north. We encountered cloud banks, but near to ETA the cloud broke and we picked up our turning at Rhyl on the North Wales coast. We were flying at a safe height for the particular leg we were on, but not if we had continued on the original course, which would have led us straight into the mountains. My decision was vindicated later, although it didn't please the navigator at the time I made it. When we returned to base we learned that a Sergeant Ken Archer, a New Zealander, and his crew were missing. Subsequently, after 39 hours of searching, the crashed aircraft and crew were found. 2 of them were dead, and the other 3, including Archer, who, although seriously injured, had courageously struggled to a farmhouse to get help. When we replotted our original track, before I made the decision to alter course 60 degrees, we established that we were on the same track that took Archer into the mountains to crash on Carnarth Llewellyn Mountain. By a comparison of both the aircraft timings, we found that we were only a few minutes behind Archer's aircraft and at the same height. Our fate could have been the same, and possibly worse than theirs. The trainee navigator apologized to me and agreed, thankfully, that the decision I made that fatal night had been well and truly vindicated. One had many close calls on a tour of duty at Llanderog, and if one survived, one became a very experienced night pilot. Not long after I got back to Llanderog from Cark, we lost the first member of the original group that came to Penrose. Trevor Blakemore, The Kiwi from Christchurch went missing on a cross-country over the Irish Sea. Despite an extensive search the next day, one of which Laurie Howard and I took part in the same aircraft, no trace was ever found of the aircraft or the crew. Trevor, sadly, was to be the first of 6 of our group not to survive the war. One other, Barry Fleming, of whom more later, was killed on the road in the early 1970s when, as an airline captain, he was on his way home from a flight. It was Christmas Eve and he ran into a truck which had pulled out of a side road. As I wrote above, Barry features in a few more stories of my life later in this book. Even such grim events can have a humorous side. Sergeant Davis, a South African in the R.A.A.F, or crashed twice on takeoff. The first time, as they went down soon after takeoff and they thought they were landing on the sand when the tide was out. Davis opened the aircraft door and jumped out, thinking he would jump onto the sand, but instead he landed in deep water. A search was launched and aircraft took off on the search, needlessly. The Coast Guard at the nearest point suddenly saw some bedraggled and wet figures come up the beach. 6 months later Davis was in an aircraft which also crashed on takeoff. Davis, not to be fooled by the tide this time, opened the door and threw the dinghy out. Only this time the tide was out and the dinghy bounced up in the air. The crew, dry and safe, walked up the beach again. Life at Landerog was not all bad, for time off brought its fun and relaxation. Carnarvon had some good pubs, the Anglesey, the Hole in the Wall, and the Royal Hotel. We enjoyed them all. There were also dances called hops at the drill hall where, due to ticket shortages, they date-stamped your hand as you paid admission. As a result of all this social activity many airmen met and married local girls, including myself. I met Gladys Mary Jones by chance, as we shared a taxi with some others going to a dance in the sergeant's mess. Although she came with someone else, we danced a lot together and I ended up taking her home and that night I proposed to her. Hasty decisions are not always wrong as we have now been married happily for 50 years. Before my courtship, the other chaps and I would make trips to Llandudno, a seaside resort with lots of girls, dances, pubs and the like. It was about a 2-hour bus ride from Carnarvon, so we could go there on our days and nights off and spend the night. We used to stay at what we called Mumsy's, a house that gave bed and breakfast and where they treated us like sons. There was Mumsy, her daughter, and her granddaughter, Hope. Hope used to go out with us to the dances and was full of fun to be with. I lost track of her until recently when I learned that, sadly, she died a year or so ago. Mumsy kept the guest book which we all signed, which is still around. I wrote a quote in it which gave cause to a lot of ribbing, especially the falling and getting up again bit. The quote I made I had read on a church billboard as follows. It is not that we will never fall, but, having fallen never fail to get up again. We became weary of local girls and Llandudno for one reason only, for if they lived up the local hill. The Great Orme, it was a long walk up and back, and on those days for no more than a good night kiss. My roaming days come to an end when Gladys and I were married in the Anglican church on Castle Square in Carnarvon on the 29th of April, 1943, following a 4-month courtship. Gladys' family had treated me like a son since I first went to meet them. Her brother was in the 18th Army in the Middle East, where he spent 4 years, so her mother took me to her heart like the son she was missing. Our wedding was not without drama itself. My father had come up from London and stayed with me at a local hotel. Because of the war all my family were scattered far and wide and not able to get to the wedding. At 8 AM on the morning of the wedding I received a phone call telling me that Barry Fleming, who was to be my best man, was missing from the previous night flight. With no knowledge of he and his crew's fate. A friend who was married to a local girl stood in for Barry. Later it was with much relief that we heard during the wedding reception that Barry and his crew had been found, injured but thankfully all alive. They had crashed into a mountain near Harlech. Barry recovered to fly again and continued doing so until his tragic death in 1970. He always told the story of his sitting on the mountain where he crashed, covered in blood, and a parachute wrapped around him. Thinking I bet old George will be bloody mad at me missing his wedding after our marriage I was given permission to live off camp at my wife's home. We were very happy indeed, and despite the continuous worry for Gladys over my safety, managed to enjoy life. She worked as a telephonist at the local exchange, and there was one very dramatic occasion for her. I was on a night flight and because of some unserviceability, diverted to Derby on the Isle of Man. Unfortunately, no word of this got through to Llanderog, and Gladys heard a call from the camp advising that I was missing. She spent several anxious hours before she found out that I was safe. Not long after our marriage, the flying schedules were changed and it was decided that there would be no longer a flight which concentrated solely on night flying, but that all crews would do a mixture of day and night duties. Those of us who had been on night flying for a year were, due to the hazardous nature of the work, beginning to show signs of strain and stress. For medical reasons the systems was changed and we were very glad of the new system. A number of my original group had left to go on ops, particularly the overseas chaps. They had complained to their own government authorities about having come all this distance just to spend all their time in a training role. Consequently, it was agreed that they would only spend a maximum of a year in the present role. Of course, this did not please us R.A.A.F types, for it meant that we had to spend longer on the job. One particularly interesting activity was developed during my stay at Llanderog, and this was the R.A.A.F Mountain Rescue Service. The service medical officer at R.A.A.F Llanderog, Flight Lieutenant Graham, had been called out to so many crashed aircraft in the mountains that it was becoming very difficult for him to cope with this extra emergency work and the normal medical needs of the base. Over a period, the R.A.A.F formed a mountain rescue service unit in the area. Graham's gallant work in building up this unit was recognized by him being awarded an MBE. It was an inspiration to know him, for his sterling efforts helped raise aircrew morale at Llanderog and in the area. The knowledge that if you crashed in the mountains and survived, a dedicated and skilled rescue team would come to your aid regardless of difficulties, was of great comfort. Some pilots had near accidents which were more amusing than tragic. One pilot, engaging in sim low flying, flew under the Menai Bridge. Unfortunately, he flew so low that he touched the water with his propeller tips. Although he did not crash, the prop tips were damaged, resulting in an inquiry and a subsequent court-martial, which reduced him down to low airman status and suspension from flying for 6 months. However, he got back on flying on completion of his sentence. Of course, we all loved low flying and we all had various escapades pursuing this adventure. It was a way of living off steam in an otherwise dangerous and also at times boring flying tour. On the other hand, if you survived a tour at Llanderog, you were an experienced pilot in night and instrument flying, with an acute appreciation of bad weather and mountainous terrain. This gave you an improved chance of meeting the challenges of future operational squadron duties. On the 24th of January, 1944, Gladys presented me with a lovely baby daughter, and this brought great joy to all the family. We named her Valerie Fitzsimon, the latter name, to carry on my mother's Irish family name. Having married a Carnarvon girl, like so many of us did, I have returned to the city and to Llanderog many times, and I have a love of the area. It is always nostalgic to visit the old haunts and to meet the Carnarvon folk, who supported us so lovingly and well. We enjoyed an empathy with them, so many had their menfolk overseas or away from home. We all felt the losses when those loved ones did not return. Finally, in March 1944, I was posted to Bomber Command. At first, this was a disappointment, as we had been promised an operational posting of our choice and mine had been to go to a fighter squadron. The reason for the change in policy was because Bomber Command needed our type of night experience. By this time I had flown over 1,000 hours, of which 230 hours were night flying, often in bad weather, just what Bomber Command wanted. I was also assessed as an above-average pilot. It was a wrench to leave my new young family, but I wanted to do my share of operational flying, for that's what I had joined the R.A.A.F to do. Despite the frustrations of the long wait to go on ops, in hindsight I think overall I gained a great deal from my 2 years at Penrose and Llanderog and was better equipped, in life and in flying, because of the experience gained. In addition, I had been appointed to a commission, and at the time I left I was a flying officer, having been commissioned from Flight Sergeant in August 1943. I was posted to number 17 Operational Training Unit at R.A.A.F Silverstone, where I was to train on Vickers Wellington bombers. It was the 6th of March, 1944, and the war was gathering pace towards a so-called Second Front, the invasion of France. It was my fervent wish to be part of this crusade to recover occupied Europe and defeat Hitler's Germany.